You've tried everything but a waitress. That's what James Harrington thought, until he saw it with his own eyes. In just one quiet moment, a young woman at a dusty diner did what doctors, therapists, and millions of dollars couldn't. She got his nonverbal son to respond, not with words, but with connection. And that moment shattered everything. James thought he knew about parenting, success, and love. He came in for a quick lunch. He left with a brand new purpose. You won't believe what happened next, or how one act of kindness changed an entire family's future. James Harrington wasn't born into wealth. Raised in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in Spokane, Washington, by a single mother who juggled 3 jobs, he learned to hustle early in life. At 16, he worked part-time at a local grocery store, sweeping floors and stacking shelves with an unquenchable determination. The older employees nicknamed him Money Man because he was always pitching side hustles or analyzing the day's sales with a curious glint in his eyes. That unwavering hunger to rise above his circumstances fueled him through college and beyond. By the time he was 29, James had launched 2 startups, one that flopped miserably, leaving him temporarily broke, and a second that skyrocketed overnight. His software development company, Harrington Innovations, transformed how small businesses tracked their sales and inventory. In a matter of 2 years, he was negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts with international firms. By his early 30s, James earned the title Silicon Valley's Dark Horse in a Forbes feature. But success came at a cost. His personal life unraveled. Stella Harrington, the woman he'd married with starry-eyed optimism, grew increasingly distant as James spent more time at the office and less with her. When Stella discovered she was pregnant, she hoped the baby might breathe new life into their stagnant relationship. Yet James's business soared at the exact moment fatherhood demanded his attention. When Oliver was born, James was so consumed with closing deals and flying to conferences that he missed many of the early milestones. Stella often brought Oliver to the Harrington Innovations office just so James could spend half an hour with him in between meetings. As Oliver grew, it became evident something was different about him. He rarely babbled as a toddler and never transitioned to actual words. Pediatricians and specialists weighed in, suspecting that Oliver might be on the autism spectrum. James, refusing to believe his child would need specialized care, poured money into private therapies, speech therapy, occupational therapy, alternative communication modalities, anything he could buy to fix Oliver. But progress was minimal. Oliver remained non-verbal, a quiet observer of the bustling world around him. Stella's patience wore thin. She pleaded with James to spend more meaningful time with their son, to learn the sign language the therapists recommended, and to nurture Oliver's unique way of connecting. But James was too busy, too distracted by mergers and expansions. Eventually, Stella left filing for divorce when Oliver was 5. She moved back to her hometown in Colorado, leaving Oliver in James's sole custody, partly because she felt James's resources could provide better opportunities for their child, and partly because Stella's relationship with James had become frayed beyond repair. Now, at age 7, Oliver had grown into a wide-eyed boy who silently watched the world. He showed affection with subtle gestures, a slight tilt of the head onto James's shoulder, or the faintest curl of a smile when a dog ran past. James, still grappling with fatherhood, tried to compensate with extravagant gifts. A new playroom filled with expensive sensory toys, the top speech therapist in Seattle, but he still lacked the intangible ingredient. Oliver truly needed someone who would connect with him on his terms in his own quiet world. Little did James know that person was about to appear in the most unexpected place, a corner cafe miles from his high-rise office. A chance meeting with a waitress named Heather Thompson was about to change Oliver's life. And ultimately, it would change James's life too, in ways he could never have anticipated. It was a late Tuesday afternoon when James found himself in an uncharacteristically plain diner on the outskirts of downtown Seattle. He hadn't planned on stopping at Donna's Home Kitchen, an old-school cafe known for homemade pies and comfort food. In fact, James rarely dined anywhere without a reservation, or at least a recognized name brand. But a sudden client cancellation left him with 2 hours to kill, and Oliver had an after-school appointment in the area. So James decided to pick him up personally, a minor miracle in itself, and wait out the time at the nearest eatery he could find. Oliver was at his usual vantage point, tucked close to James's side, eyes scanning the surroundings. The diner smelled of bacon grease coffee and something sweet, maybe the day's special pie. A neon sign fizzed in the front window, partially obscured by a drooping curtain. The tables were covered with red checkered cloths that reminded James of old family outings he never had time for anymore. Everything about the place felt archaic, but also oddly comforting. They settled into a small booth near the window. Oliver slid in next to James, not across from him. James couldn't help but notice the tension in his son's posture, as if the boy wanted to be invisible in this new environment. The waitress, a petite woman with honey-brown hair, pinned into a loose bun, appeared at their table. Her name tag read, Heather Thompson. She offered them a bright smile, though it faltered slightly when she saw Oliver's fearful glance. "Welcome to Donna's," she said, placing 2 menus in front of them. "Can I get you something to drink?" James had done this 100 times. He'd speak for Oliver, or simply gesture that Oliver was shy. But before he could say a word, Heather knelt down so she was eye level with Oliver. In a soft voice that carried genuine warmth, she asked, "What would you like to drink, sweetheart?" Oliver didn't respond. He never did to strangers. But something about Heather's posture, her tone, made him pause for an extra second. He tilted his head, taking in her face. Then slowly, he turned to his father as if seeking guidance. James, startled, replied, "He usually likes apple juice." Heather nodded, and without missing a beat, signed something with her hands. The motion was quick but fluid, a small combination of signs that ended with her pointing to Oliver inquisitively. Oliver's eyes widened. He didn't sign back, but he stared at her hands with a spark of recognition. James's heart quickened. Could she possibly know sign language? "What?" was that James asked, trying to maintain his composure. Heather stood up again, looking a bit sheepish. I noticed he seemed hesitant to speak, and sometimes I'll use sign language if I suspect it might help. I volunteer at a local community center where a lot of the kids communicate using ASL, or augmentative devices. James swallowed hard. It wasn't every day a stranger made an effort to communicate with Oliver, using methods he'd been advised to use himself, methods he'd let slip, in favor of chasing business deals. "That's very kind of you," he managed. "I didn't realize you knew sign language." "I'm not an expert," Heather admitted, "but I pick up what I can. I've found it's a beautiful way to make people feel seen and heard, whether or not they can use verbal speech." Right then, James watched as Oliver leaned forward, pressing both hands on the table, never taking his gaze off Heather. The diner's chatter faded around them. In that moment, there was a tiny yet pivotal spark. Oliver appeared more curious, more at ease. For once, James didn't feel the weight of pitying stares or the frustration of not knowing how to help his son communicate. Heather jotted down their drink order and disappeared into the kitchen. James felt an unfamiliar warmth bloom in his chest. He couldn't quite pinpoint why, but a flicker of hope, something akin to relief, flickered inside him. Oliver was paying attention to someone else, not withdrawing or shrinking back. Little did James know, this casual exchange was the beginning of a seismic shift in his relationship with Oliver, and it was the start of a complicated chain of events that would soon test James's resilience, force him to confront his own failures, and catapult Heather into the center of his life in ways he never expected. Over the course of that afternoon, James found himself returning to the diner's menu multiple times, hardly reading it. Instead, he watched Oliver and Heather interact. Every time she approached their booth to refill water glasses or check on their meal, Heather would sign a simple question or greeting to Oliver. Sometimes Oliver would just stare his eyes wide, seemingly mesmerized. Other times he'd tilt his head curiously or scrunch up his nose as if trying to remember how to replicate her signs. To James's amazement, Heather remained patient. She didn't push Oliver to respond. She simply offered him quiet invitations to join the conversation. It was the first time James realized how crucial patience was in communication. He'd spent so much money on therapy sessions that promised quick progress, but he'd never seen someone so gently and persistently try to connect with his son on a personal human level. "You're good with him," James ventured. After. Heather brought their food scrambled eggs and toast for Oliver, grilled chicken sandwich for James. Heather shrugged, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I love kids, especially ones who need that extra bit of encouragement." She glanced at Oliver, her expression softening. "He reminds me of my younger brother Darren." James raised an eyebrow. "Your brother?" "Yeah," Heather replied. "He has cerebral palsy and doesn't communicate verbally. He relies on sign language and a communication board. Growing up, I realized that the world can be isolating if you don't speak in the usual ways. That's why I try to learn as much ASL as I can. It made my brother feel less alone." James felt an unexpected tug at his heartstrings. He had no idea how to respond, so he nodded and took a sip of water. Across the table, Oliver was busy examining his scrambled eggs, occasionally glancing up at Heather. The meal continued in a peaceful lull, broken only by the ambient chatter of other diners. James felt oddly reluctant to rush off to the next appointment. He was used to perpetual motion calls, meetings, more calls. But now he found himself leaning into the moment. After they finished eating, Heather placed the check on the table. Oliver gazed at her name tag again, his lips trembling as if he wanted to form a word. That fragile attempt made James's chest tighten. He couldn't recall the last time he saw such a determined look on his son's face. "Do you mind if I ask, is there a reason you stopped by this place today?" Heather asked, looking from James to Oliver. James shrugged. "I was in the area waiting to pick Oliver up from his therapy session. Figured we could grab a bite." He hesitated, then added, "Usually he's with a nanny or at a special learning center. I don't get many afternoons free to do stuff like this." Heather nodded, her gaze lingering on James. "Well, I'm glad you did. It's nice to see you two spending time together." The sincerity in her voice cut through James like a knife. He realized with a pang of guilt how rarely he actually spent one-on-one time with Oliver. Shifting in his seat, James pulled out his wallet and handed Heather his credit card. Despite owning an extravagant lifestyle, he wasn't in the habit of carrying much cash. He wanted to leave a tip that matched his gratitude, but he also worried about insulting Heather, who seemed too proud to be swayed by large sums of money. Ultimately, he left 40%, a gesture he hoped would at least communicate his thanks. Heather returned with his receipt, and to James's surprise, she grabbed a napkin and a pen. Scribbling something quickly, she slid it across the table. "This is my personal number," she said, cheeks flushing slightly. "Sometimes the community center I volunteer at holds free sign language workshops for parents. If you're interested." James stared at the numbers on the napkin. He was rarely at a loss for words, but in that moment, all he could muster was, "Thank you. I'll consider it." Oliver tugged at his father's sleeve, then pointed to the napkin, as if understanding it was important. James pocketed the slip of paper. As they left, he couldn't help but glance back to see Heather standing by the kitchen door, waving goodbye to Oliver, with a small sign. Something James promised himself he'd look up later. Oliver offered the faintest wave back, a fleeting moment that made James's heart swell with an emotion he wasn't used to feeling, unfiltered hope. That evening, back in the luxurious Harrington penthouse, James tried to push thoughts of the diner out of his mind. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of downtown Seattle, glittering with city lights. Everything in James's home was pristine marble countertops, modern artwork, and custom furniture. He'd spared no expense ensuring Oliver had a comfortable environment, a private therapy room lined with sensory-friendly toys, a state-of-the-art home theater, and even a specialized reading nook. Yet for all the high-end comforts, the penthouse often felt hollow. Oliver sat on the living room floor, methodically stacking building blocks. Even though the boy had a separate playroom, he tended to gravitate toward spaces where James lingered, as if wanting to be close while still immersing himself in solitary play. James watched him for a few moments from the sofa, the slip of napkin burning in his pocket. He couldn't stop replaying Heather's interaction with Oliver. The gentle way she signed words, the way Oliver actually reacted, not with his typical blank stare, but with genuine curiosity. The more James thought about it, the more he realized he'd been too focused on fixing Oliver's nonverbal status. He'd paid for specialists, yes, but he'd rarely engaged in Oliver's world himself. The memory caused a dull ache of regret in his chest. With a sigh, James stood and walked to the polished oak desk in the corner, retrieving the napkin. Heather's number was scrawled across it, alongside a small note. "Anytime you have questions about sign language, the community center, or how to connect with Oliver, feel free to reach out." James smoothed out the napkin and opened his laptop. Curiosity compelled him to search for local ASL resources. But as soon as he typed ASL classes for parents in Seattle, his phone buzzed a message from his executive assistant, Linda. Another urgent business matter. Another crisis that demanded immediate attention. Another reason to push fatherhood aside. Before responding to Linda, James glanced at Oliver, who was now trying to balance a red block atop a teetering tower. In a moment of clarity, James silenced his phone. He walked over to Oliver and lowered himself onto the floor next to him, ignoring the multi-$1,000 sectional couch behind them. Oliver shifted to make space, looking at James curiously. Feeling awkward, James picked up a block and tapped Oliver lightly on the shoulder. The boy paused, turning his head. James lifted the block up to his eye level and then pressed it gently onto the top of the tower. "Block," he said slowly, trying to enunciate. Then he tried to mimic a sign he'd seen Heather use earlier. It was sloppy, but it was a start. Oliver's eyes flickered in recognition. He reached for another block, carefully placed it on the tower, and then touched James's hand. There was no sign, no word. But there was contact, a subtle moment of shared focus. James felt a surge of excitement as if they'd stumbled upon a new language all their own. Eventually, Linda's text would go unanswered for another 20 minutes, while James continued to explore this strange, wonderful territory with Oliver. Though small, this was a beginning. A father deciding, perhaps for the first time, to enter his son's world wholeheartedly. That night, after putting Oliver to bed, James returned to his desk and typed out a text to Heather. His fingers hovered over the send button. "Hi, Heather. This is James Harrington, the father of Oliver. I'm interested in learning more." Before he could second-guess himself, he pressed send. Heart pounding. For James, it felt like crossing a threshold he'd avoided for years, a step toward Oliver's silent universe, a step that might change everything. Heather responded the next morning with warmth and enthusiasm, inviting James to attend an upcoming sign language workshop at the Evergreen Community Center. Despite his jam-packed schedule, James found himself clearing, Thursday evening determined to follow through. He rarely set aside personal time during the work week. But something about this felt urgent, essential, even more pressing than the business deals stacked on his desk. On Thursday, James navigated through Seattle's rush-hour traffic, Oliver in the back seat gazing silently out the window. The boy seemed calm, though James couldn't gauge whether Oliver had any idea where they were going. Truthfully, James wasn't sure either. He'd never been to a community center. He imagined a run-down gym with flickering lights and questionable ventilation, hardly a place for millionaires. Yet as soon as they arrived, James realized how inaccurate his assumptions were. The Evergreen Community Center was a spacious modern building with large windows that welcomed in natural light. The lobby displayed colorful murals painted by local youth. A friendly volunteer at the front desk directed them to a room labeled Intro to ASL for Parents. James paused outside the door, hearing muffled laughter and conversation from within. Oliver clung to his hand, glancing at the hallway's bright fluorescent lights, but not recoiling. Taking a deep breath, James opened the door. Inside, about a dozen parents and children were seated in a semicircle. Some kids, like Oliver, were evidently nonverbal or hearing impaired. Others just seemed shy. At the center of the room stood Heather and a tall man in his 30s who introduced himself as Joshua, a deaf instructor. Heather's face lit up when she spotted James and Oliver. "You made it!" she exclaimed, waving them in. Immediately, she handed Oliver a small laminated card with basic signs like "Thank you, hello," and more. The boy examined it intently, his curiosity piqued. Joshua began the session by explaining the alphabet in sign language, demonstrating each letter with deliberate gestures. Next, Heather introduced simple words like eat, drink, play, and home. James tried to replicate each sign, feeling a bit self-conscious, but forging ahead. Oliver sat quietly, occasionally fiddling with the edges of his laminated card. But James noticed his son was taking everything in. At one point, Joshua asked for a volunteer. A young girl named Lily, who wore hearing aids, eagerly raised her hand. She and Joshua demonstrated a short greeting dialogue in sign. When Lily turned to the parents with a grin, James sensed Oliver straighten in his seat, as if enthralled by her hand's graceful movements. Near the end of the workshop, Heather approached Oliver. She moved slowly, ensuring not to invade his personal space. Signing hello, and my name is Heather. She then pointed to him, encouraging him to sign his name in return. Oliver hesitated, glanced at James, then carefully lifted his hands. Although the result was clumsy, it was a clear attempt at the sign for his name, Oliver, which James had taught him once, but never saw him use unprompted. Tears pricked at James's eyes. In that moment, The usual corporate Titan facade melted away, replaced by a father feeling both overwhelmed and fiercely proud. Oliver had just made a genuine effort to communicate something James had rarely seen outside of clinical settings. When the session concluded, the group applauded in ASL-style hands waving in the air. Heather gently touched Oliver's shoulder in celebration, and though Oliver didn't respond in kind, James could tell his son was thrilled in his own quiet way. As people began to disperse, James felt a surge of gratitude toward Heather for inviting them. If not for her, he would never have experienced that moment of breakthrough. Outside, as dusk settled over the city, James realized he had a choice to make. He could treat this evening as a one-time bonding moment, or embrace it as the foundation of a new path with Oliver. Gazing at his son's sleepy face in the rearview mirror, James decided he couldn't go back to his old routine. He wanted no need to learn Oliver's language literally and figuratively. He glanced at his phone, seeing multiple missed calls from Linda, urgent texts about a client presentation. Normally, he would hurry home, open his laptop, and immerse himself in damage control. Tonight, however, he turned off his ringer. Oliver came first. Over the next few weeks, the transformation in James's life became increasingly evident. He started leaving the office earlier on Mondays and Thursdays to attend the Evergreen Community Center's open practice sessions with Oliver. While he still managed Harrington Innovations during the day, conducting high-stakes meetings and negotiating lucrative contracts, he now meticulously blocked out personal time in his calendar, a move that left his colleagues astounded. Heather remained a constant presence. Sometimes, after the practice sessions, they'd all linger in the community center's cafe sharing simple meals while Oliver flipped through ASL flashcards. Heather offered James tips on how to incorporate sign language into daily routines, labeling objects in the penthouse, creating visual schedules to ease Oliver's transitions, or turning mealtime into a small communication lesson. James soaked up every bit of advice like a parched plant desperate for water. One Friday evening, after a particularly engaging session, Heather surprised them with an invitation. "There's a fundraising event tomorrow for the kids at the center game booths, a raffle, a small silent auction. You two should come." It'd be a chance for Oliver to practice signs in a fun environment. Normally, James would politely decline, citing an urgent business trip or a prior commitment. But he found himself saying we'd love to, just like that father and son had plans for a Saturday afternoon that didn't involve therapy appointments or private tutors. Instead, it involved carnival games and the promise of laughter, a foreign concept to James in recent years. When they arrived at the fundraising event, James was struck by how lively everything was. Tables were lined with homemade baked goods, children ran around with bright face paint designs, and volunteers manned simple carnival booths. Oliver clung to James's sleeve at first, overwhelmed by the chaos. But as soon as he spotted Heather manning a Guess the Candy Count booth, he relaxed. "Hey, Oliver." Heather greeted, signing the words as she spoke. She produced a small plastic cup and pointed to a giant jar filled with colorful candy. "Want to guess how many?" Oliver studied the candy jar, then glanced at Heather. He raised one finger, then another, his rudimentary attempt at counting. James smiled, ruffling Oliver's hair. "We'll make a guess together," he said, scribbling 237 on a slip of paper. Oliver eyed the slip with curiosity, seemingly fascinated by the process. As the afternoon wore on, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He was relaxed, engaged, even happy. He cheered Oliver on when the boy tried to toss a beanbag into a clown's mouth, and he laughed when Oliver flung the beanbag too high accidentally hitting a balloon overhead. Instead of scolding him, James gave a playful shrug and helped retrieve the beanbag. Oliver's shoulders eased, and he attempted a small smile, an expression James had only caught fleetingly before. Later they meandered over to a quiet corner where a live acoustic band played gentle tunes. Oliver was mesmerized by the guitarist's fingers. James recognized the look his son was studying the musician's movements, almost like he did with sign language. Heather, finishing her volunteer shift, joined them. "He seems to really enjoy music," she observed. "Have you ever tried music therapy for him?" James shook his head. It was yet another idea he'd glossed over in his quest for immediate fixes. Heather's presence reminded him there were countless opportunities to engage Oliver in creative ways, if only James was willing to see them. Before the event ended, the host announced the raffle winners. To James's astonishment, they won a small basket filled with children's books about sign language, each with colorful illustrations and easy-to-follow instructions. Heather clapped and cheered for Oliver, who gazed at the prize with wide eyes. James felt his heart expand as though witnessing a series of small miracles. That night, James carried Oliver exhausted yet content into the penthouse. As Oliver drifted off to sleep, James reflected on how drastically his life had shifted. The man who once thrived on negotiations and business expansions now found more fulfillment in seeing his son take baby steps toward communication. And the waitress knew. The woman who had sparked all this change felt like an anchor he never realized he needed. Monday morning brought a storm of emails, phone calls, and escalating tensions at Harrington Innovations. Despite James's personal breakthroughs, the corporate world hadn't paused for his fatherhood journey. In fact, it was teetering on the edge of a major crisis. A key investor threatened to pull funding if certain software features weren't delivered on time. Stockholders were skittish, and Linda peppered James with urgent messages about how to handle the brewing turmoil. James arrived at the office early sharp in a tailored suit. Gone was the relaxed father from the carnival. Now he was all business, jaw clenched as he navigated his company's near panic. He gathered his senior team, pored over financial projections, and led back-to-back strategy sessions, trying to reassure everyone that Harrington Innovations would weather the storm. But under the conference table, he kept receiving texts from Stella Oliver's mother, who had caught wind of the sign language classes and wanted to be involved, or at least informed. In a twist of timing, Stella was in town for a conference that same week. She asked if she could visit Oliver. Normally, James would bristle at the request, after all she'd left him in Seattle. But now, a tiny voice inside reminded him that Oliver deserved access to both parents. Reluctantly, James agreed to meet Stella for coffee to discuss next steps. They met at a sleek downtown cafe. Stella arrived wearing a charcoal grey skirt suit, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. She looked tired, but determined. They barely exchanged pleasantries before diving into the subject of Oliver. "I heard you've been taking him to sign language workshops," Stella said, stirring her black coffee. "I'd like to be included in that. Maybe take him to a session while I'm here." James stared at the foam swirling in his latte. "I think that'd be a good idea. He's made some progress. I'm learning too." Surprise flickered in Stella's eyes. "You are? I never thought I'd see the day." Her words weren't laced with malice, but they stung. James knew he'd been distant before, and Stella's skepticism only reinforced his guilt. "You're welcome to join us on Thursday," he offered. "Heather. She's the one who told me about these classes will be there." Stella nodded. Heather, she repeated, as if tasting the name. So that's the waitress you mentioned in your texts. James inhaled sharply, realizing he'd mentioned Heather when telling Stella about Oliver's improved engagement, but hadn't gone into detail. She's more than just a waitress, he clarified. She volunteers at the community center, knows sign language, and has been helping me figure out how to connect with Oliver. Stella's expression softened. That's good, James. I'm glad you found someone who can guide you on this path. Honestly, I regret not forcing the issue earlier. They spoke for another half-hour about co-parenting strategies, and for once it felt less adversarial. Stella even suggested coordinating schedules so Oliver could spend some weekends in Colorado, an idea James had once rejected outright. But now he saw it might benefit Oliver to have both parents in his life, as long as they approached it with sensitivity. By the time they parted, James felt a strange relief. Despite the corporate crisis simmering back at the office, progress on the personal front felt tangible. He had no illusions that repairing the damage in his relationship with Stella would be easy, but for Oliver's sake, he was willing to try. Later that day, James returned to his office to find Linda pacing outside his door. "We've got a serious situation," she said, her voice low. "A rival company just announced a competing product. Investors are frantic." James tightened his grip on his briefcase. The fatherly calm he'd cultivated over the weekend was slipping. For the next several hours, he was back in crisis mode. Phone calls, urgent board meetings, and damage control with potential partners. The day dragged into evening, and James realized he wouldn't make it home in time for dinner with Oliver. Guilt gnawed at his stomach, but duty called. Somewhere between a tense phone call with the CFO and drafting a press release, James's thoughts drifted to Oliver. He pictured his son's inquisitive eyes and wondered what signs he might be practicing before bedtime. Heather's encouragement played like a soft echo in his mind. Any small step you take with Oliver matters. With renewed determination, James finished his work, delegated tasks to his team, and dashed off a message to Oliver's nanny. He asked her to read one of the new sign language storybooks with Oliver and promised he'd be there for bedtime tomorrow. One day lost wouldn't ruin their progress, he told himself. But deep down, he recognized it as a slippery slope he'd been on, before a slope he vowed never to slide down again. A week later, the tension at Harrington Innovations reached a boiling point. A powerful investor, Richard Levinson, was furious about the delayed software rollout. Rumors swirled that he might pull out entirely, putting the company at risk of a stock plummet. While James scrambled to retain investor confidence, he felt the pressure gnawing at his newfound commitment to Oliver. Yet amid the chaos, something extraordinary was happening at home. Oliver was signing more frequently simple requests like drink help and bathroom. He still hadn't spoken a word, but James knew better now than to measure Oliver's worth by verbal milestones. Each sign felt like a triumph. Heather continued to offer support, sometimes texting James short tutorial videos or links to websites that demonstrated advanced signs. She also noticed that Oliver showed an interest in drawing, suggesting art therapy as another avenue to explore. One Monday evening, after an excruciating day at the office, James returned home to find Oliver in the living room, crayons scattered around him. A large sheet of paper showed scribbles that vaguely resembled shapes. Intrigued, James asked the nanny what Oliver was doing. She shrugged. He picked up the crayons and started drawing all on his own. "I think he's calm and focused when he does it." James knelt beside Oliver, who allowed him a peek at his drawing. As usual, Oliver didn't offer an explanation, but James noticed it looked like a swirl of colors, blue-green, and a blotch of red. He pointed at one shape. "Oliver, can you sign what this is?" Oliver hesitated, his eyes darting to the nanny, then back to James. Slowly he formed a sign that James recognized from the laminated card home. Then he pointed at the red splotch and attempted another sign. Something close to happy. A lump formed in James's throat. Was Oliver trying to depict his home as a happy place? Carefully, James signed back. "Is home happy?" Oliver lifted his eyes, meeting his father's gaze, and gave the closest thing to a nod James had ever seen him give. Emotion surged through James like a tidal wave. He had spent years building a sterile, immaculate environment, thinking that was what Oliver needed. To see that Oliver associated home with happiness was both relieving and humbling. Perhaps love and attention meant more than any specialized gadget or luxury therapy space. Suddenly, James's phone buzzed. He saw Richard Levinson's name flash on the screen. A wave of dread coursed through him. Carefully, James rose from the floor and moved to the kitchen, taking the call in hushed tones. As expected, Levinson was irate, threatening to pull out if the software wasn't delivered by the end of the quarter. James pleaded for more time, trying to assure him that Harrington Innovations was on the verge of a breakthrough. But Levinson's patience had worn thin. When James ended the call, his hands shook. He felt trapped between his role as father to a special needs child and CEO battling a corporate meltdown. In the past, he would have thrown himself into all-night work sessions to mitigate the crisis. But now he glanced at Oliver still on the floor, crayons in hand, looking up with trusting eyes. Something shifted in James, a resolve that wouldn't let him revert to his old patterns. He wouldn't let Oliver become collateral damage. He texted Linda, instructing her to set up a high-level meeting with the software team first thing in the morning. Then he walked back to Oliver, sank down beside him, and picked up a crayon. The crisis would wait at least for an hour, while he helped his son create a masterpiece of swirling colors. Oliver offered him a second crayon, and father and son drew side by side, forging a silent bond thicker than any corporate contract. Late Tuesday afternoon, Heather invited James and Oliver to a special event at the community center, a small talent showcase featuring children who used various communication methods. Some would be signing songs, others using communication boards to tell stories. Heather explained it was meant to celebrate the diversity of expression and encourage kids to feel proud of how they communicated. Though James's schedule was frantic, he promised Oliver they would go hoping the exposure might inspire him. Stella, still in Seattle for business, decided to join as well, making the event an impromptu family outing. The thought of Stella, Heather, and James, all in the same space, made him uneasy, but he was determined to keep the focus on Oliver. When they arrived, the center was bustling. Parents milled about, adjusting microphones, setting up chairs, and making sure their kids' devices were charged or their sign language partners were ready. Oliver clutched James's hand tightly, but there was no fear in his eyes, just an alertness, as though he sensed something important was happening. The event kicked off with a performance from Lily the little girl who wore hearing aids. She signed the lyrics to a popular children's song, while music played softly in the background. The audience watched captivated as Lily's hands danced in graceful arcs. Oliver's gaze never left her. Stella leaned over to James, whispering, "He's really paying attention." Next, a boy named Matteo used his communication device to tell a short story about his pet turtle. Each robotic-sounding phrase triggered laughter or applause from the supportive crowd. Oliver looked from Matteo's device to James, as if trying to make sense of it all. Finally, a group of kids, guided by Heather, performed a simple sign language rendition of "You Are My Sunshine." Oliver shifted in his seat, eyes wide. Stella gently placed a hand on his back, encouraging him to watch. James noticed Oliver's hands twitch slightly, as if he wanted to participate, but didn't know how. After the performance, the community center opened the floor for any child who wanted to share a talent or expression. Heather beckoned Oliver, but he shook his head, burying it in James's side. James shrugged apologetically, figuring Oliver needed more time before tackling something so public. But then Stella knelt down, signing, "Do you want to try?" Oliver stared at her for a moment. Then, to James's surprise, he nodded. Stella looked up, eyes shining. "He wants to try," she whispered. Heather guided Oliver onto the small stage area. The room fell silent, the audience ready to offer unconditional support. Oliver's breathing was rapid. Stella placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Quietly, Heather signed, "Show us something you love." James swallowed hard, not sure what Oliver would do. For a few agonizing seconds, Oliver froze. Then, in halting, unsure motions, he formed the sign for happy, repeated it, and followed with the sign for home. Next he pointed to James, then Stella, and finally touched his own chest. The signs were jumbled, but James recognized them: happy home family. A wave of emotion crashed over James. His eyes blurred with tears. Stella pressed a hand over her mouth. The audience, many of whom understood sign language, broke into gentle applause, their hands waving overhead. Heather wiped her own eyes, proud of Oliver's bravery. That cluster of signs, unpolished as they were, was Oliver's declaration, his way of saying he was happy with his family, that he felt at home among them, that he recognized this feeling of togetherness. In that moment, James realized how drastically his perspective had changed. It wasn't about fixing Oliver or making him speak. It was about meeting Oliver where he was, celebrating each small victory and nurturing the bond that had taken root in silence. As Oliver stepped off the stage, James and Stella enveloped him in a tender hug, tears mingling with smiles. For the first time, it truly felt like they were a family, though unconventional, still fiercely connected. Inspired by Oliver's performance, James felt more committed than ever to bridging the communication gap. He attended every sign language practice the community center offered. He even arranged private tutoring sessions with Joshua, the deaf instructor, so he could learn more advanced concepts. Over time, James grew more confident in signing simple conversations with Oliver, praising him whenever Oliver attempted new signs or showed initiative in communicating his needs. Throughout all this, Heather remained a guiding presence. She'd occasionally visit the Harrington penthouse to help structure Oliver's environment for optimal growth. She'd even bring homemade muffins or cookies, claiming they were just a little something for Oliver. But James noticed he was always on her mind. Their late-night text exchanges became a lifeline for James, who often grappled with insecurities about whether he was doing enough for his son. During one of these visits, while Oliver was engrossed in drawing, James pulled Heather aside to the balcony, overlooking the sparkling city skyline. He exhaled slowly, gathering the courage to address the unspoken tension between them. "Heather," he began, "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done. You've given Oliver a chance to really communicate, and you've helped me see what's important." A soft breeze ruffled Heather's hair. She looked away, shy. "Seeing you two grow closer has been a reward in itself. Oliver's amazing. And well, you're trying so hard, it's admirable." James hesitated, then took a step closer. He searched Heather's eyes, his chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and something else, something warm and hopeful. "I'd like to do more for the community center, maybe sponsor new programs or a bigger facility. It's the least I can do." Heather's face lit up. "That would be incredible. There are so many kids who need resources. But you already donate your time and money." "I can do more," James said firmly. "I want to invest in a new wing dedicated to inclusive arts and communication therapies. Oliver and kids like him could benefit." Heather swallowed hard, tears brimming. Before she could respond, Oliver appeared at the balcony door, looking mildly confused to see them there. James immediately flashed him a reassuring smile and gestured for him to join them. Oliver came outside, gazing at the city lights, then at Heather. Without warning, he formed the sign for thank you, not directed at James, but at Heather. Heather's voice caught in her throat. She knelt down, returning the sign. "You're welcome, Oliver," she murmured softly. In that moment, James realized he owed Heather more than just financial support. Her compassion had ignited a profound change in both father and son, bridging worlds that had long felt distant. Though they stood on the precipice of uncharted emotional territory, James felt a sense of clarity. He wanted to build not only a philanthropic legacy for Oliver's sake, but also something deeper, a personal bond with the woman who had taught him how to love his son better. As the evening wore on, they rejoined Oliver inside. Heather eventually slipped out, leaving James to reflect on how his life had pivoted in just a few months. Where once he counted success in quarterly earnings and investor satisfaction, now he measured it in the glow of Oliver's eyes whenever he managed a new sign, in the way his son looked at him with an ever-growing trust. And Heather's role in all of it felt simultaneously natural and extraordinary, like a missing piece finally found. Despite James's evolving priorities, the business crisis at Harrington Innovations intensified. Richard Levinson wasn't bluffing. He had set a hard deadline for the software feature integration. The team was behind schedule, struggling to iron out glitches. With each passing day, investor confidence waned. James tried to remain calm, splitting his time between the office and Oliver's needs. But stress took its toll. He slept less, snapped at coworkers more frequently, and found himself checking corporate email during Oliver's bedtime routine, something he'd vowed to avoid. One morning, Linda rushed into James's office, her face ashen. "Richard Levinson just sold half his shares," she announced breathlessly. "The market's reacting. We need a statement." James closed his eyes. This was the doomsday scenario. If Levinson's move triggered a sell-off, Harrington Innovations could face a dramatic plunge in stock price. Ironically, James found himself less worried about personal financial ruin than what it would mean for the hundreds of employees under him. Still, the weight of responsibility felt crushing. James locked himself in a conference room with his legal counsel and PR team. They drafted an emergency press release outlining a plan to expedite development. Over the next 2 days, he barely left the office, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. He missed Oliver's sign language classes, broke his promise to read a bedtime story. Guilt gnawed at him, but he convinced himself it was only temporary. He'd fix the company, secure its future, and then return to being the father Oliver needed. But time was merciless. On the third night, with no breakthrough in software integration, a wave of negative press articles hit the internet. The product launch fiasco overshadowed everything James had done right in the past. Harrington Innovations began trending on social media for all the wrong reasons, in a rare moment of clarity at 2 a.m. James slipped out of the building and found himself walking aimlessly through the deserted downtown streets. Rain drizzled cold and relentless. Images of Oliver's trusting face flashed in his mind. He felt torn between saving his company, the empire he'd built from scratch, and being present for his son's critical developmental milestones. A memory of Oliver at the community talent show surfaced, the boy signing Happy Home Family. At the time, James thought it was a testament to the progress they'd made. Now he worried his son might sense his absence and retreat back into silence. Could James afford to fail Oliver again? He pulled out his phone and saw a message from Heather sent hours earlier. "Haven't seen you at the center. Is everything okay?" James stared at the text, the soft glow of the screen illuminating the raindrops, sliding down his face. He realized he didn't have a good answer. Nothing was okay. He typed crisis at work. "Sorry, we'll explain soon." He pressed send, feeling an ache in his chest. As James stood there drenched outside the towering skyscrapers, he wrestled with a haunting realization. Perhaps success in the corporate arena had been his lifelong dream, but Oliver's well-being was his ultimate responsibility. The irony that a waitress Heather had taught him more about fatherhood than years of therapy or medical professionals hadn't escaped him. She'd shown him the simplest truth, that Oliver didn't need him to be a billionaire. Oliver needed him to be a dad. With renewed determination, James returned to the office. There was no chance of rest tonight. He had to salvage what he could. But a promise echoed in his mind once this storm passed. He would never again allow work to overshadow Oliver's needs. He'd find a way to secure both, or he'd choose Oliver. The lines had been drawn. By the end of that tumultuous week, Harrington Innovations managed a short-term fix. The software team, working around the clock, produced a beta version of the much-anticipated feature. While far from perfect, it was enough to placate Richard Levinson, who agreed to halt further stock sell-offs. The company's stock stabilized, albeit at a lower price point, and James scheduled a major public update to reassure stakeholders that Harrington Innovations remained competitive. Exhausted but triumphant, James realized it was now or never. He had to follow through on his promise to Oliver. The next morning, he took a personal day, ignoring the avalanche of emails piling up. Oliver deserved his full attention. He arrived at the penthouse just as Oliver was finishing breakfast with his nanny. The boy's face lit up upon seeing his father unexpectedly. James felt a pang of guilt quickly overshadowed by gratitude for this chance to reconnect. He sent the nanny home early and announced a surprise outing, a visit to the Children's Museum, where they offered interactive exhibits designed for kids of all abilities. They spent hours exploring brightly colored rooms. Oliver was drawn to the art corner, painting swirls of color, much like his earlier crayon drawings. James joined in, splattering paint on his own canvas, caring little that he was wearing designer shoes. Whenever Oliver struggled to communicate, James patiently signed with him, ensuring he felt heard. By mid-afternoon, they took a break in the museum cafe. Oliver munched on chicken nuggets, while James sipped a smoothie. For the first time in weeks, James felt truly at peace. He glanced down at his phone. No urgent calls, no catastrophic emails. In the hush of that moment, he understood what true wealth meant. Then, like destiny beckoning, Heather appeared. She was there on a group trip with some children from the community center. She spotted James, and Oliver hesitated, then approached with a beaming smile. "Fancy seeing you here," she teased gently. James chuckled. "We needed some father-son bonding time. I've been absent, and it was time to fix that." Heather nodded her eyes, reflecting understanding. She turned to Oliver and signed hello, to which Oliver responded with a shy version of the same sign. Heather's gaze swung back to James, a question forming on her lips. Before she could ask, James reached for her hand tentatively, gently. I wanted to say thank you, he began. Not just for Oliver, but for me. You showed me what it means to truly be present. I don't think I can ever repay you. Heather's cheeks colored, but she squeezed his hand softly. You already have James. Seeing you here choosing Oliver, this is all the thanks I need. A flutter of hope lodged in James's chest. In that instant, he felt the future opening up. Not as a plan he orchestrated, but as something living and breathing, shaped by love, growth, and shared purpose. They joined the community center group at an exhibit showcasing interactive musical instruments. Oliver gravitated to a digital drum pad, pressing it with wide-eyed fascination. Sounds of percussion echoed through the room. Heather and James stood on either side, encouraging him. Oliver eventually reached for their hands, guiding them to the drum pad so they could play too. 3 sets of hands, 3 hearts aligned in a spontaneous jam session that transcended words. By day's end, Oliver was visibly tired, yet content. James accompanied Heather back to her group's bus. Before parting, he leaned in and whispered, I'd like to talk more about our next steps, my philanthropic plans for the community center, and maybe even plans for us. Heather smiled, her eyes shining. I'd like that. For once, James didn't feel the weight of deadlines or corporate battles. He felt light, carried by the revelation that real success lies not in fortune, but in forging connections that endure. And as Oliver nestled into his arms, drifting off in contented exhaustion, James silently vowed that this was only the beginning of their story. One written in signs, trust, and a love that required no words to be understood. James Harrington thought his son needed fixing, but what Oliver needed was to be understood. He didn't need more specialists. He didn't need more silence. He needed someone like Heather to simply meet him where he was. That waitress gave James a second chance at fatherhood, and from that moment on, he chose love over legacy. He showed up. He learned to listen in a new language, and in doing so, he built a bridge where words had failed. If this story reminded you that the smallest acts, like learning to sign or sitting on the floor with a child, can lead to the greatest breakthroughs, then please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Help us spread more stories where compassion changes lives, because sometimes it's not the millionaires who teach the lesson. It's the waitress with a heart full of understanding.